The next guest I have in the studio today is Bennie, a co-founder and portfolio manager from Castle Point. Welcome. Nice to have you in here, Stephen.
Thanks for having me in, Phil.
And I listened to you on the Meet the Managers Roadshow recently, and your presentation, as usual, was very good, and I was interested to talk to you about that. So at the moment, markets are interesting, and people are looking at their portfolio.
That's a polite way of putting it.
And portfolio, they're looking at their investments, and they're actually seeing drawdowns happening at the moment, and starting to ask questions about, should they be worried, and how does this fit in with their big long-term plans? So can you first of all sort of explain the drawdowns and what they are?
Sure. Well, drawdowns aren't taking money out of your fund. That's withdrawal and redemption. When people talk about drawdowns, they're talking about your performance of your portfolio coming off. And typically what you talk about there is you've hit an all-time high in your fund, and you subsequently have a sell-off. And you see the share price go down and the value of your portfolio go down. Now, the amount that you fall is the depth of the drawdown. The time it takes to get back up to that previous high is the duration of the drawdown. So deep and long drawdowns are unpleasant.
Yes, and obviously some of the worst ones were around the depression and things like that, but they happen all the time. And what's really interesting is you found a study of God's portfolio, which is essentially the best portfolio you could ever put together. How did that perform over time? And maybe you can just sort of explain that portfolio.
Yeah, well, it performed quite well. Where it comes from is it was a group called Alpha Architects in the US did a study. And what they did was they took the share price returns of the S&P 500 constituents going from 1927 to 2017. So you got 90 years of share price returns. And that gives you perfect foresight. And so what they did with that perfect foresight of knowing how everything was going to perform, they created God's portfolio. And how they did that was every 5 years, they took the best performing 50 companies. They knew what they were going to be with certainty. And they created God's portfolio from those 50 companies. And then they'd rebalance in 5 years. They bought another 50 companies that were going to be the best. So what you've got here is a portfolio that's not just on the best companies, but it's going from sector to sector over time that's the best performing. So you do well. Now, if you'd just been in the 500 for that period, 90 years, you get a good return. You started with $1, it went to 50,000. That's just by being in the S&P 500 index. Passive investing over a long period in equities is a great return, 50,000. But unsurprisingly, God did better. God turned $1 into 12 billion.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so as an annual return, what was that?
29% annualized return.
Yeah. But it wasn't all a smooth ride.
No, that's where it gets really interesting. And the chart we've got up here is a chart showing drawdowns. So
and there's quite a lot of them in there, which might surprise people.
Yes. Yeah. So the red shaded drawdowns are the S&P 500. The dark blue shaded drawdowns are God's drawdowns. And they're significant as well. You can see that through time, anytime the red mark, the S&P 500's had a drawdown, God's had a drawdown too. And that's remarkable because he's owning the best 50 companies, always owning the winners.
Yeah. So he's actually got the best possible portfolio that you could put together.
Yep.
And he still has drawdowns.
Yeah. So he's stacked full of winners and he gets drawdowns as big as the market.
See, that's really interesting because if people look at that and they think, they keep getting told the story, invest in shares, and over the long run they always go up, but it's just not a smooth ride.
It's your time frame that's important. They don't go up every quarter or every year, but if you're in for a long time, if your horizon's decades, then the always goes up applies. Now the interesting thing is how you're going, well, how can God have those drawdowns owning the best 50? And it's because the principal reason is that when share markets are having a sell-off and a deep drawdown, getting into crash, bear market territory, people become very fearful and treat all companies the same. So selling becomes indiscriminate. So even the best companies get sold off aggressively, even though it turns out they bounce back quickly and are ultimately winners. they get involved and drawn into drawdowns and that investor sentiment.
So did God's portfolio recover quicker than the market?
Well, not always.
Not always.
That's the interesting thing. And if you, this slide we've got up now shows you God's 1 year return relative to the S&P 500. So where that he's above zero, he's outperforming on a 1 year basis. He's beating the S&P 500. You'll see though there's several occasions when he's well below the return of the S&P 500, significantly. Particularly in the Great Depression in the 30s, he had a terrible time. He had drawdowns of 50%, 5-0, but 50% behind the S&P 500. And that's a startling thing to see. And it does remind you, don't look at a manager's 1 year return. It doesn't tell you anything, for good or bad. Much more important to look at their 5 year numbers and their 10 year numbers.
Or even longer,
Yes, exactly. And on those bases, God always did well. But occasionally you get a bad year.
So how is his volatility compared to the market?
Very similar. I mean, you've got volatility is part and parcel of the share market. You know, they sort of go together. They're two sides of the same coin. You get great long-term returns, as we were talking about, if your time horizon's 10 years or more. But in the short term, over a 1 year period or less, or maybe a couple of years, you can get volatility, which is drawdowns. You don't get one without the other. Even God had to pay that price of volatility in the short term to get to his 12 billion. And if you weren't prepared to have drawdowns, you didn't get to your 12 billion. The other factor as well is that you've got to stick with God, even though he's having a bad time. His 1 year numbers look pretty dire.
So Stephen, what's the really important messages out of there for financial advisors?
Well, I think they're twofold. You've got to get clients through these drawdowns.
And it's the hand-holding and...
Yeah, exactly. And we will get through it. We know that. We don't know quite how long it'll be or how deep we're going to be, but we know we'll get through it. And the other important takeaway is when a financial advisor is assessing a fund manager that they may want to use for their clients, don't focus on the 1 year number. That's not really telling you anything that they're good or bad. 5 year numbers are what you want to look at. There's information there, preferably 10 year numbers or longer. And if they're good, then you probably have a manager who's adding sustainable value to for your clients. Where they're bad, they're probably not doing the job that they're trying to get paid for.
I know it's not financial advice, but it's good advice. Thank you for that, Stephen. Great to have you in here.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me in.
Cheers.